this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan. We were supposed to speak, I think, exactly a week ago. And then our episode got delayed by 1 week. But I think it's a blessing in disguise because your piece, All Fall Down, was released just last week. And I wouldn't have been able to maybe, tackle these 5 pillars with you after the recording ended. So I'm really lucky that it came out just days after we were supposed to record. And here we are. And the reason I'm bringing this up from the beginning is because I think it's easy to get sort of distracted by the minute details that are happening today, day by day, and it's always healthy to step back, look at the larger picture, what kept Lebanon standing after the civil war ended, and what's happening in perspective. So I highly recommend anyone listening or watching to check out this article, and I'll link it to the episode. But before we jump into that sort of heavy terrain, I want to ask you, Maha, just your day-to-day life at the moment in Beirut. And I mean it in the widest terms. Your work routine with the electricity cutouts, COVID-19 cases on the rise, and maybe to a degree you're still you're trying to have a social life once again after having been locked down for a long time. The pain and agony that we're all seeing, these sort of video clips that go viral of petty theft, petty crime, and then of course the severe hunger, the distress, the agony that's sort of visible throughout the country. I know it's a very big and very maybe depressing topic to start with, but I'm curious just your own immediate experience given what we're seeing right now in Beirut, and whether or not your day-to-day life has actually altered that much, given the stresses, given the pain, whether or not you're able to still have a fairly normal routine in a very abnormal environment.
Hi, Ronnie. It's great to be with you on this podcast. Life in Beirut these days, I would say, for the longest time for me, life in Beirut, before the collapse, before the COVID-19, life in Beirut has been like living in a pressure cooker. And the pressure just keeps increasing. And this has been going on, I would say, since 2005, particularly after the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, if I may go back that far. It was followed with a spate of assassinations, starting with a dear friend, Samir Kassir, and then it kind of just went downhill from there. Fast forward to 2020. This is the centennial of Lebanon. Lebanon is this year exactly 100 years old. And I feel like we're, the analogy of the metaphor of the frog or the lobster that's in hot water. Yeah. And you keep increasing the heat and it's dying, but it doesn't realize it's dying. It's just adjusting to the heat. Since 2005, we've literally been living in... We've been adjusting to a rapidly deteriorating situation on multiple fronts, on the security, on financial, etc. It's all come down to a head right now. Yeah. The economic and financial collapse, coupled with COVID-19, have made what seemed to be an impossible situation back in January or in October when the protests started seem even more impossible today. My day-to-day routine, there's nothing normal about it. You try and maintain we're still working from home. We took a decision not to go back to the offices. I did not want to take the risk of having any one of my colleagues be in a situation. I mean, we can do our work from home. We have that luxury. So there's no need for us to be back in the office and in that way, particularly now that the infection rate is going up.
Right.
So you try and maintain some sort of normalcy of you do your work, see family. Socially, the network is still very, very, the social bubble I personally move in is quite limited, mainly out of concern for my own family, particularly my mother. So there's nothing normal about it. Yes, people are resuming some sort of, Lebanon in Beirut is incredibly sociable.
Yeah.
We're out every night, almost. And there's always something going on. There's a concert, there's a show, there is a dinner, drinks with friends. It doesn't matter. There's always something going on.
Yeah.
This is all evaporated. The summertime is usually when all the big musical festivals are happening. Beit Din, Baalbek, Byblos, etc. None of that is happening this year.
Yeah.
So this is the period when everybody comes from abroad to visit their friends and family. So people you haven't seen for a year all of a sudden show up on your doorstep. That's not happening either. I mean, some are arriving, but you really don't want them to show up on your doorstep unless they finish their 14-day quarantine.
That would be impressive. 14 years.
14 years, yeah, exactly. So there's nothing normal about our lives. We go on with daily routines.
Yeah.
You go to the market, you eat, you breathe, you do the things you need to do. I've taken up some gardening, which is nice. Fun.
Really? Oh, no. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. And you're
on my balcony, by the way.
Yeah, right. These are images I've seen, and I've sort of heard people discussing gardening. So you're the first person I've spoken to who's literally done this during the COVID experience, gardening. So yeah,
I've always it's something I always liked. And
I see. Okay.
Since I'm here.
Right.
My job requires me to travel. This is a period where I'm grounded in Beirut. It's fun. It's nice. I like it. I'm enjoying it to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Let's not get carried away.
Sure.
So let me indulge in this hobby, if you like. And it's been fun. It's been fun. But now I'm realizing, what have I done to myself? I actually have to take care of these things.
Yeah, right. They're like, in a way, they're like children. You have to tend to them and make sure they live and grow up properly. And
start on the
No, but I'm glad you've actually. I mean, so before we started recording, we had a very nice exchange about many things that resonate with you and they resonate with me. And I'm glad that in this conversation you've already brought up many things that I think are critical. And I'm glad that you referenced 2005. In many conversations I've had, the dates, and you were hesitating on going back that far behind. Most of the time it goes back to 1990, or it goes back to 1975, or for that matter 58, or 43, or on occasion Ottoman era. I mean, it goes back as far back as you want. I'm glad you've actually, in a way, you honed in on a moment that is not that far back in time, and I think still resonates today. Maybe it's changed to a point, and maybe the issues have evolved to a point, but I think that's a healthy sort of marker. And you mentioned Samir Kassir. Without sort of any hesitation, you bring him up. I think of him as a part of the October uprising, even though he's not with us. But I can sort of imagine that he would be fully on board with this moment as well. So there's a linkage there. And of course, you also described that everything went downhill since then. Not just in terms of repeated assassinations, but the political evolution of Lebanon following the Syrian withdrawal has not been a very good sort of story. Many things have sort of devolved into where we are today. But again, I like that that's the marker that we're sort of starting with, because I also think this flows naturally into the piece you wrote not that long ago, a few days ago, in Carnegie, in Diwan. Now, You mentioned four pillars that have collapsed, and the fifth one is wobbling, but you also leave the fifth one as sort of wobbling, that it's not standing properly. So in a way, it's both. It's the post-war order, and it's also the post-Syrian withdrawal order that are coming to an end. I want to start off by just touching on the first one, because I think that feeds in nicely to what we were just discussing. It's the first pillar. It's the Taef Accord. Now, I am old enough now to have lived through the entire Taef experience. I mean, I grew up in a primarily post-war environment. I saw everything that Taef was supposed to be and never was. I saw all of its failings. I think everyone that lived in Lebanon in the 1990s up until 2005 saw maybe, unfortunately, the worst aspects of Taef. And I'm glad that you hone in on one thing in particular. I'm going to quote you to you here. The Taef Accord, which I love doing, by the way. I love taking advantage of these moments. The Taef Accord, the settlement ending that conflict, foresaw Lebanon's transition to a civil state in which sectarian representation in parliament would end. In exchange, all sects would be represented in a new Senate, whose authority would be limited to deciding on major national issues. Yet those parts of the accord were never implemented. Today, sectarian governance has become far more entrenched in state institutions, making change extremely difficult. When I read that, I can almost look back in time to what people were trying to do right now, back then. And even that issue of the Senate is now 30 years old, and it seems still like a distant dream. And that the sectarianism that many of us talk about every day is more entrenched today than it was in 1989. So let's start with there. That's sort of the end of the Taef Accord, and maybe also the reasons it's ending may actually be what it was supposed to do and never did. And we can talk about civil state and Senate and all of the above. But in your mind, is Taef right now irreparable, that we need something brand new? Or is it something that was never really implemented to begin with, that we never gave it its due chance, that we're still living in that sort of 1989 zone, where Taef never became, in a way, a new republic? It just ended the civil war, it ended the gunshots, but it left a paralyzed state intact.
Okay, you've brought up quite a few points. Let me start with why I talk about 2005, why I start there and not in 1990, and then I'll go into Taef.
Sure, yeah.
For me, 2005 was a transitional period. It was a transitional year for Lebanon. It marked the beginning of something different and something new. It ended the 1990 to 2005 was one period in the post-Civil War era. 2005 with the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, the Syrian forces leaving Lebanon under popular pressure and international pressure, and the sense of euphoria of we're at the cusp of actually building Lebanon, the Lebanon we want again. And there were many lessons there, many lessons about what does a transition mean and how does one go about it, and is a transition possible with a political leadership that is not only entrenched in state institutions, but is also the legacy of that civil war.
Right, yeah.
So to answer your question, for me, the problem is not Taef per se. The Taef Accord, if one were to take it at face value, it was about shifting the balance of power, or the power sharing of modus operandi, from being an equal one between the Christians and Muslims. Yeah. The Taef Accord said, we are not going to look at demography, at the demographic balance of the different sectarian communities. We're not going to take that into account.
Right.
We're just going to go and say, so it's not about the weight of the population that will determine representation. We're just going to say we want equal power sharing for everyone.
Right.
And the idea was that you're supposed to move to a civic state by creating the Senate, so that religious groups, particularly minorities, don't forget, Lebanon is a state that recognizes 18 different religious sects. This is unique.
Yeah.
And it's for me, it's a public good, and it's a regional public good in that sense. So the idea of the Senate was that it would be a place where the leadership of the religious groups would have a say in matters of national concern.
Right.
And where minorities, especially, I usually don't use this term, I don't like it, but let's say smaller groups, feel that they have a say and that their own interests are being protected.
Right.
Don't forget, the Civil War was one where there was a lot of identity, polarization on the basis of identity during the Civil War. So the sense of being afraid of each other was very much still part and parcel of the social makeup of this country.
Right.
So to my mind, the challenge, the Taef was never implemented as such. Let's not forget. And again, the question in my mind, how did they even think it was going to be implemented in 1990? When the political settlement that basically was cemented in Taef was about ending the conflict on the street and moving it to institutions. What you did was you took the heads of the militias and you simply moved them to state institutions and basically said, this is your war booty. This is your war bounty. Sorry.
Yeah.
Here you are.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. They took over specific institutions and treated them as, extensions of their own fiefdoms. This is at a time when the presence of the Syrian army, but also Syrian political influence, was enormous. So any possible reform that could have been implemented at that time was also complicated considerably by their influence. So even if there was an interest, it just wasn't happening.
But I'm curious. So in that sense, with that 15-year delay, is 2005 therefore the beginning of trying to implement Taef without that kind of pressure? In other words, the Syrian army... Not necessarily. No.
Not necessarily.
Okay. Yeah.
I think in 2005, what you saw on the street, 2005 represents a couple of things for me. On the one hand, it was about, again, I apologize for the use of those terms, but it was about the Sunni community coming in and saying, Lebanon first. So finally accepting or admitting to a Lebanese polity as such. Because if you want to go back in time, if you recall, when Lebanon was established, until the 50s and 60s, you had some of the key elites within the Sunni community who still would say, I'm from Lebanon, Syria, or Beirut, Syria. So
some of my favorite postcards of Beirut say Beirut, Syria, and that's not that long ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not that long. So there was a resistance to this entity that was called Lebanon. This was the period of Arab nationalism. So the sense that you're in Lebanon, but you're part of something much larger than Mount Lebanon.
Right.
So 2005 was the end of that, and it was the beginning of a Lebanon first kind of sentiment.
Right.
Many see it as the moment of the Christians and Sunnis coming together, which kind of left the first component out in the outside the which is the Shias mainly.
Yeah.
But so in that sense, that's one thing about 2000. The second thing was the sense of it is possible. Things are possible. It's possible to push the Syrian army out. It's possible to actually start working towards a civic state. I remember during that period, the positive energy, the amazing energy I saw on the street was just remarkable. The amount of talks I was being invited, the amount of initiatives that were being launched about how to move to a civic state, how to move towards a secular state and not just in Beirut. This was across the country, across everywhere.
Yeah.
This was the period, so there was this sense of euphoria. But then political leadership comes out, takes a look at all of a sudden, thousands of people thronging to the streets. I mean, I remember the night that, the second night after Prime Minister Hariri was killed. It's important to kind of recall this. Thousands of people took to the streets spontaneously.
Yes.
This was the first time we were seeing this in Lebanon, where people were just going to the streets to protest the assassination of a prime minister, many of whom actually were not necessarily in agreement with.
Right.
But the sense of injury, of who are you to assassinate our own prime minister,
Right.
So people were thronging to the streets on their own without any push from the political leadership. And in this instance, the Lebanese were way ahead of their own political leadership. And I recall distinctly, seeing some of the associates of this leadership, calling them up and saying, come see what's happening.
Yeah.
Literally, the second night, come see what's happening. That's the time when, many of our friends went to the streets, they started organizing, and then it kind of took a more formal, if you want, initiative, or became a more formal effort.
But let me ask you then, and I'm only sort of, I want to maybe pick your brain on that sort of dilemma of a civil war ending with a template on how to move the state forward. And then you also have, in a way, a population that's demanding better. They're trying to hold the Syrian regime to account by asking the Syrian, or demanding the Syrian withdrawal, and pointing the finger at that regime for Hariri's assassination. So there's that kind of upswell of sort of demands for justice and accountability. But that doesn't necessarily translate with what Taef set out for. In other words, and I hope I got this right, that you have communities maybe seeing eye to eye on certain things, but it's not necessarily the beginnings of what Taef set itself up for, which is a Senate, a civil state, the sort of removal of sectarianism. That's still sort of that's a distant goal.
It was an aspiration.
Just an aspiration.
It remains, to my mind, an aspiration,
right,
of where people wanted to take Lebanon. So today, when people say, we don't want Taef anymore, I just think, well, it was never implemented.
Right.
And I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't forget, the end of the war ended in a political settlement, which this was at the time of the first Gulf War. There was the Pax Syriana. There was agreement, both international and regional. Let's just end this conflict. Syria would take control. Iran was pacified by allowing Hezbollah to maintain it. The kind of consensus that somehow you would have, I think it was Walid Jumblat who once said, you would have a Hong Kong style, development and tourism and growth and all of this in one part of Lebanon, and you would have a muqawami, a resistance, in another part of Lebanon, and that somehow these could coexist, and they did coexist. They did cohabit for a very long time, uneasily, with a lot of tension, but they did coexist for quite some time. I think that formula is no longer feasible.
Right.
If I can just say one thing. To me, the struggle since 2005 has really been, initially it started about how to move towards a civic state, how to try and move towards the implementation even of Taef, if you like, how to deepen Lebanon's democratic experience. But then, as time passed, with the resistance of the political elite to any kind of change, and the fact that you no longer had an external arbitrator in the way Syria was operating, and then you had new actors entering into the scene, the levels of clientelism, nepotism, the control they gained over state institutions became a lot worse. So rather than trying to deepen Lebanon's democratic experience, we ended up in a situation where we're trying to preserve what was left of our democratic institutions.
Exactly.
When you go for 2 years without a president, when you go for, months on end, 7, 8 months without a government, simply because, there has to be one particular minister in that government. I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
But I'm curious about that. Okay,
And
so
this is partly, sorry,
no,
this is just partly also, let's not forget, I mean, the other kind of landmark year was 2008 and the Doha Accord.
right,
Because for me also, the Doha Accord kind of spelt the beginning of the end of the capacity of the Taef Agreement to function. What I say in my piece is not that the Taef Agreement has come to an end, but that its capacity, the power sharing agreement that was supposed to be, implemented via Taef, has not come to an end. It's not collapsing, but it is completely stuck. It's no longer able to reproduce itself. It's not able to admit any new players into the game. It's just there's a complete bottleneck, and it just won't move anymore. And this started with the Doha Accord, where all of a sudden we started talking about these governments of national consensus or national unity governments, where everybody is part of government, which meant that everybody, government since 2008 rarely spoke about strategic issues. It's
right.
Every minister for themselves, and everybody has a veto in everybody else's business. You can't run a country like this.
Yeah. No, but
But
that's, in a way, it's offering that the widest perspective, which is that on October 17, you suddenly had sort of that kind of euphoria that now things were going to finally improve, that there's going to be a healthy state down the road, there's going to be reform, some level of accountability, some decency and dignity with relationship between the state and citizenry. It almost seems like the aspirations of 1989 were in a way being addressed by the population, not by the political elite, but by the population. That there was sort of what Taif said itself, what it was supposed to be, its popular base, if you will, ended up sort of showing up on the streets in October 17. So it's almost like regional settlements brought us Taif. Regional settlements kept Lebanon sort of wobbling to a point, whether it's Doha or others. And then even today, in a way, it's almost like without a regional settlement, Lebanon is facing its first domestic attempt at trying to do what Taif was supposed to do, without that kind of regional sort of oversight. It almost seems like now is the time, if any, for that aspiration to come to life, even if it doesn't work in the end.
But you see, that depends. I think that what was remarkable about the October 17th movement, and continues to be remarkable, are two things. For the first time, again, not for the first time, but we had not seen this number of people come to the street on their own, without politics. For the longest time, the complaint was always people will only go to the street when their political leadership demands it. Here we are, October 17th, 18th, 19th, and it went on. People were coming down in the thousands to the street to protest their own leadership.
Right.
The depth of the protest within each community was significant.
Yes. Yeah.
From, and every single one of those communities.
Yeah.
That, for me, was quite important. The other part was the breadth of the protest across the country. From the beginning, I was saying, don't look at Beirut. Look at what's happening in Tripoli, in Saida, and in Sur.
Yes.
These are the litmus tests, and this tells you how deep the discontent is across all communities. Lebanese citizens realized they'd been taken for a ride, and that this whole sectarian, it's not that they cared any less about their sectarian belonging. It's just the realization that, in fact, sectarianism has only impoverished them a lot more and created kind of an equal opportunity abuse for the political leadership. So while all the political leadership benefited from sectarianism, all the Lebanese, irrespective of what sect they belong to, lost. fluffed out.
But Maha, can I ask you though, before we get to the second pillar, and I think this because it's a very important one. I think it's the one with the longest scope. Do you think today the protesters see a civil state, or even for that matter, a Senate that preserves the mosaic that you described earlier, where again using that word carefully, minorities feel secure within a state that's less sectarian, but that their survivability is there. It's sort of entrenched, that they have their place in a Senate. And that's an idea from 31 years ago. Do you think the average protester today sees that as a goal? Or is it something that's different today? That it's almost like what was supposed to happen in the early 1990s has very little connection to what's happening right now. That it's almost like separate chapters, if you will.
I think for some protesters, that issue still matters. And now, as people get more hungry, as the political parties are taking advantage of the economic collapse and of COVID-19 to reconnect in a stronger way, they didn't lose that connection, but to reconnect in a stronger way with their own communities by providing food and medicine and all of this. So that temptation is still pretty much there.
Right.
However, I think in response to your question, it really depends who you're talking to. I think and what I see is for a lot of the younger protesters, they really don't care. Yeah. They don't see themselves as Sunni or Shia or Durzi or Maronite or Orthodox or Catholic or Jewish. They see themselves as a youth that actually wants a shot at making it in Lebanon without being forced to emigrate for a better opportunity. This is what we were hearing all the way at the beginning of these protests. And I think this is, again, across the board amongst all communities. So you've got that. I mean, what I find interesting today is I think there's kind of a tug of war between a vision amongst a good cross-section of the protesters who are maybe different in their outlook and in how they see things happening and their ideological positionings on a spectrum from right to left, on economics, on politics, etc. However, they agree on looking out or wanting their aspiration is a civic state, not necessarily secular, but a civic state.
Right.
And versus a vision championed mainly by the current political elite, which is to maintain a very heavily entrenched sectarian, power sharing formula,
right,
that treats you as part of a community and not as an individual. So for many of the protesters, they see themselves as individuals. Yes, being part of a religious community is important, but it's not how they define themselves. They see themselves as individuals. They want their rights and responsibilities as citizens of this country and not as members of a community, of a particular community. Which is, by the way, unfortunately, the Lebanese constitution, to some extent, allows the religious communities to mediate the relationship of the individuals to their state,
right,
whether through personal status laws, even educational facilities, etc. I mean, there are different ways where the constitution itself, through specific articles, has opened the door for that.
Right.
And allows you to be treated as a member of a community and not as an individual citizen. I mean, today there aren't. Let's talk about women. Women are not treated equally in Lebanon. They don't have the same rights because when it comes to divorce, when it comes to inheritance, when it comes to child custody, when it comes to a whole bunch of issues related to personal status laws, they have to follow their own religious community.
Yes.
So custody of a child, and it's not the civic court that decide this. Often it's the religious court. So custody of a child will vary depending on which denomination you belong to.
So in a way.
So I think,
oh, sorry. Yes, please.
But just that there's this tension, I think, between these two dramatically opposing visions. for Lebanon.
But it's interesting. It's almost, I mean, if we look back to two markers, the 2005 marker and 1989, that sort of, you have many reasons why Lebanon is sort of stuck in a way. And it's stuck whether it's from geopolitical concerns or whether it's through what we're seeing right now, sort of massive corruption and this sort of horrible version of what Lebanon is supposed to look like. But at the same time, you have, in a way, there's an exposure of what Lebanon really is at the end of the day. And you have a protester on the street that sees himself or herself as a citizen, as an individual citizen that wants to be treated that way. That, in a way, is going back to 1943, whether that protester realizes it or not. But that's the foundation of the country. And then you have the worst forms of that foundation fighting for survival. So in a way, Taef never really happened. It's just sort of an aspiration that never really saw the light of day. And what you're seeing
I'll take you back further.
Yeah.
The first ministerial declaration of the government of Riyad al-Salah in 1943, I believe.
Yeah.
If I read out the text, I can try and dig out the text in a second. Yeah. It talks about ending sectarianism.
You're kidding me.
That's the first post-independence ministerial declaration.
1943. That was
Hold on.
That's insane.
Let me fish it out for you, and I will read to you what they say about sectarianism. Yes. Among the foundations of reform, which are required by Lebanon's higher interests, is the treatment of sectarianism and the abolition of its negative aspects. The foundation of sectarianism hinders national progress and hurts Lebanon's reputation, not to speak of its poisoning the spirit of relations between various spiritual communities that make up the Lebanese people. We have now seen how, in most cases, sectarianism has been a tool to ensure private interests or sap the strength of national life in Lebanon to the benefit of others. We are confident that when the people are filled by the national sentiment that has arisen under independence and the system of popular rule, they will be reassured and accept the abolishment of the sectarian system, which weakens the nation. I continue. The moment at which sectarianism is abolished will be a blessed moment in the history of Lebanon of comprehensive national awakening. With God's help, we will strive to see this take place soon. Naturally, its achievement will require preparation on various fronts. We will all cooperate to pave the way and prepare for this, so that all are reassured to the achievement of this critical national reform. What we have said about sectarianism applies also to regionalism, which, if it becomes stronger, will turn a single nation into many. Wow. And amongst the reform that this declaration talked about was also amending the electoral reform, organizing national rule, and attaining social justice.
That's an incredible quote. That's an incredible statement. So that's the first ministerial statement in Lebanese history. Maha, yes. I mean, I know we sort of were deep into the first pillar, but I just want to get maybe a final thought from you that this is 77 years ago. Riyad Salah should be in Martyrs Square right now protesting, if anything. I mean, and 77 years later, we're still dreaming that dream. Just, can I get maybe your own personal perspective at why this includes all of the messy situations we've been in? This includes civil war, this includes economic crises, this includes everything in modern Lebanese history. Why it remains a perpetual dream. Why it's sort of, even the first prime minister of Lebanon spoke the same language that a protester may sort of, it will resonate with the average protester today. Why it seems to be a perpetual dream. Why something like Taef is just an aspiration. Why things never really take hold, where you can transition the Lebanese state into something that functions, something that meets the expectations. I'm curious about that. It's almost 8 decades of trying. That's the entire Lebanese experience. So I mean, why is 2020 as maybe challenging as 1943, as any year where Lebanese have tried to effect change?
I think more challenging. 2020 is much more challenging because sectarianism is far more entrenched in the system today than it was in 1943. Lebanon was established as home to different communities. It was initially thought of as a home for the Christians, but it grew to include a number of different communities. Since its birth, it's been seen as a place where pluralism, people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds could coexist. The tug of war, to my mind, has been between recognizing individuals as individuals in their own right, as citizens in a state that treats them all equally, and as being members of a community, members of communities that need to be preserved, that need to be protected, that need to be reassured constantly. And unfortunately, for the Lebanese today, is that the latter has consistently won out. And the reason why it has won out is because of the marriage between politics and religion. Because of the way religious identities, or identities in general, but particularly sectarian identities, have been instrumentalized politically to the point where you can't pull the two apart in a system like Lebanon. The vested interests in this marriage have been almost impossible to overthrow. This is internally. Now, of course, we're operating also in a region where Lebanon, again, because of the nature, the way it's constituted, many of these communities also have their own international relations who get involved in the country. And so, we're not going to go into the history of the way geopolitics impacts Lebanon as well. But at least internally, for me, that tug of war has always come out in favor of protecting the community at the expense of individuals.
I think it's almost
and
like...
Interestingly...
Go ahead. Yes.
It's interesting because this does not diminish from the sense of being Lebanese that you hear amongst, the Lebanese.
Right.
We used to joke and say when they're outside of Lebanon, they're gun-ho Lebanese. The moment they come back to Lebanon, everybody becomes not part of their community, part of their little neighborhood. We're back to being part of some village, neighborhood, dai'a, whatever it is. So it's there,
But I like that analogy of a tug of war, and then there are intervals where at some point there's a pull sort of towards the individual, but that it's never sort of the appropriate force is not there to kind of sort of change it fundamentally. That it's almost like a pull and then a pull back in the other direction. I like that sort of. It's almost like against all odds, this system seems to win. And whether it's in 1943 or whether it's 2020, it is far more entrenched than any of us appreciate, and hence its victory over time.
The vested interests in this system are also huge. There's a lot of power.
Yes.
When you instrumentalize identities in this way, it gives you a lot of power over people.
Absolutely.
Today, if you ask religious leaders to, just the battle over civil marriage, let's talk about the topic, which is a big issue in Lebanon. Just the battle over civil marriage is astonishing. The moment you talk about not mandatory, but actually an optional, giving people the option of marrying, in civil courts rather than in religious courts in Lebanon. And immediately all the religious leaders say, there will be blood on the street if you even think about it. It turns violent.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is about losing power. It's about losing power over their constituency.
Right.
Today, anything you need to do on the personal front, you have to go through your religious community. And that gives them a lot of power to manage people's lives.
That historic perspective is so important to addressing the foundations of what needs to be addressed right now. It's almost like it's easy to maybe shout at the executive or ask for a prime minister to resign or a president to step down or a speaker to leave. But at the end of the day, the foundations haven't really shaken yet. And I think that's kind of where that...
Well, this is where I think the push, the changing Lebanon needs a bottom up and a kind of a push down.
Right.
This is not, I mean, this system is almost ossified, and it's not going to be easy to change it. The way you want to change it, yes, people are right to ask for, the resignation of all these people. They're right to ask for a government. And I think also we need to distinguish between this, and maybe this is a chance to move to the second pillar, which is the economic crisis that the country is facing.
Yeah.
Today, do you want to?
But yeah, I'm going to quote you again. And it's the second pillar, Lebanon's role as a merchant republic. And again, your words, in a country that imports almost everything it consumes, informed capital controls and the cancellation of lines of credit to businesses show a banking system that no longer functions. Now, I'm going to also go back in time a bit. That's, in a way, my memory of post-war Lebanon. The banking sector growing, and now in hindsight, maybe growing a bit too big, but nonetheless growing. And that confidence that was so unusual, where you see Lebanese around the world eager to send their money home. And that kind of assurances that kept these banks alive, kept them functioning. And then it's only in the last few years where things got outrageous, in particular those crazy interest rates that we all know about. But before then, there was a healthy level of confidence, despite many reasons to take your money out. This case in point is the events of 2005, the war 2006, the the events of 2008, the Doha settlement that only temporarily solved those problems, but obviously they were never dealt with. I mean, the assassinations that continued, the Syrian war next door, all the reasons to not have your money in Lebanon, yet Lebanese were confident enough. And the banking sector seemed to be sound.
Not just the Lebanese, by the way.
You're absolutely right.
Not just the Lebanese.
Yeah.
2008 financial crisis, money flowed to Lebanon. 2011, the Syrian conflict, money flowed to Lebanon. Those money came to Lebanon because they had confidence in the banking system. This is the merchant republic. Lebanon was the Switzerland of the East. It's where banking secrecy was upheld as something sacred. So this is the DNA of this country. It's location.
I'm curious.
To provide that kind of safe haven.
Yeah, but I'm curious, the durability.
And it's also, by the way, other services.
Beyond the banking sector, you mean? Beyond,
yeah. Real estate, tourism. I mean, also
sure.
Other sectors.
Let's actually include all of them: the banking sector, the services, and tourism and the like. But that seemed to withstand domestic problems and regional crises. And it's the last few years that things became extremely shaky. And it's really since October that we've seen that the unexpected, that sort of the hyperinflation that we think of in the 1980s towards the end of the Civil War, maybe early 1990s, it's now part of life again. So that shocking conclusion, if you will, would you put the onus there on regional issues? Meaning, do you think that this pillar is collapsing, simply put, because of the Syrian war? Or is it something that was bound to collapse regardless of regional turmoil, that this pillar was so shaky at its core that it was just a matter of time? Because I'm curious that it's really something that seemed to manage itself fairly okay. And then the last few years sort of took a nosedive. But then in 2006 and during the financial crisis throughout the world. I mean, there we go. Every episode. Every episode. This is the moment we should celebrate. You're still here, but the lights are gone. There we go.
Okay. Here they come back again.
She's back. It wouldn't be a Lebanese episode without this.
I mean, that's how you know I'm speaking from Lebanon.
Yeah.
I'm in Beirut.
And if it doesn't happen, I'm going to ask the guests to turn off their lights and turn it back on. There we go again. Yes.
Out again. You know what, Rani? Let me check because sometimes I'm بتك
Sure,
الساعة
sure, sure,
عندي.
sure.
Let me
Yeah,
just check
of
that
course.
it's the whole building and not just me.
Sure.
Ah, we're back. Okay,
Hey,
there we are.
hey, أول مرة. Usually it's one in, out. هالمرة it's two. So this is
Yeah.
a more special conversation. No, it fits the moment. I'm curious just why the banking sector was sound enough, and it's only the last few years, and it's really more recent than other issues, that it kind of took a nosedive. That whether or not we can sort of look abroad in terms of the reasons why this sector suffered immensely, or for that matter, is it something that was bound to collapse regardless of regional turmoil? That this pillar was really the foundation wasn't in place. Just your own reflection on why it survived earlier crises and why it took a nosedive this time around.
It's management.
Mm,
I mean, you have a system. The banking sector has always been one of the pillars of Lebanon's economy, historically and until very recently. But I think gross mismanagement of the system, again, the marriage between political and economic gain, greed, the greed of bankers and others, a system where there are no checks and balances in place, and when they are there, nobody actually uses them.
Right.
I'll just give one example. In the last maybe 20 years, if not longer, Parliament has not once called in the governor of the central bank to discuss financial schemes he was putting together, high interest rates he was offering. None of that. It's only recent. I think it was about a few months ago. It was his first trip to Parliament to respond to questions from the parliamentarian subcommittee on finance. This is mind-boggling. And this is just one small example. The incestuous relationship between politicians, bankers, and others literally created a situation of gross mismanagement. Lebanon was living way above its means. The central bank was funding state spending, and i.e. funding politicians de facto, because politicians were using state institutions to enrich and to actually, we're using the state coffers to for their own purposes, whether to enrich themselves personally or to spend on their own political constituents, whether it's through hiring, levies on whatever deals being put together.
But with that severe mismanagement, and it's good to remember that, it's easy to forget that 2 decades he's not called in, so there's almost like a shielding of.
It got worse, Ronnie. It got worse. So there was severe mismanagement, but then you start off with the countries acquiring a bit of debt, and it's still manageable. Balance of payments is still workable. Remittances are coming into the country. There's confidence in the system. People are putting their money here. You have a lot of Gulf support, so they're willing to put their money here. I mean, there was a lot of both international goodwill, but also confidence of the Lebanese in their own system. Expats, I think we had something like $8 billion coming in every year in remittances.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of that. That confidence started eroding with the sense that, and it accelerated, I think, again after 2005, the sense that whereas pie used to be divvied up between, let's say, 4 groups, all of a sudden, it became 6 or 7 groups that wanted a piece of that pie. So they were all getting smaller bits now. That's one.
Right.
Their international backers, money from international backers, dried up. After 2008 financial crisis, less and less money, and it went on from there, less and less money was coming into the country, particularly from Gulf countries, especially to these political parties. Meanwhile, the U.S.-Iran tension was also increasing. So we're having more sanctions on, on different entities in Lebanon, more laws coming into place, the banking system being required to cooperate with American laws on sanctions, on money laundering, etc. And then 2011, you have the Syrian conflict erupt, which actually brought money into the country. So a lot of Syrians brought their money.
It's almost like the regional crises are not part of the story in that sense. That it's just
they are.
Oh, they are.
They're very much part of the story in the sense that the regional and geopolitical play two roles. On the one hand, when the Friends of Lebanon stopped being the Friends of Lebanon, that stopped quite a bit of the money flow into the country.
Right.
And then the pressure in terms of sanctions, now the Caesar bill, etc., also, makes it much more difficult for money to flow through the system.
Right.
Meanwhile, the number of actors internally, so it's a constellation. I mean, it's a coming together of both external and internal factors.
Yeah.
Internally, the number of groups that now wanted a piece of that pie had grown, while that pie had shrunk, was getting smaller and smaller.
Right, but at the core,
because there weren't enough resources coming in.
But at the core is one of mismanagement, regardless. That, in other words, the protective measures that were not taken have sort of brought us to where we are.
I mean, in technical terms, yes, a peg to, an unreasonable peg to a dollar at a 1,500 Lebanese lira to the dollar rate was cost.
Right. Yeah.
It cost the country a huge amount, so on and so forth. So there were bad policies in place, and this is where a lot of the mismanagement came in.
Right.
But all of this was been dealt with. And in 2016, when we hit the brick wall and we were about to crash land, then they came up with these financial engineering schemes. So it would have been much easier, let's put it this way, to deal with the crisis in 2016 than it is today.
That's interesting.
And today, with every single day we lose without what could have been done in December is no longer feasible today. Or it's feasible, but it won't do the job anymore.
Right.
Every day is costing this country a huge amount, and it's setting the country back, don't want to put a number to it, but it's setting the country back tremendously. With every day that passes, the financial and economic foundations of the country are becoming weaker, and its prospects of recovery become that much more difficult.
Right.
So in December, we were talking about how to avoid a decade, a lost decade. Now we may end up talking about how to avoid, lost multiple decades.
Yeah.
Maybe even a generation. I don't know the way things are going.
So in a way, this is a classic sort of analogy of kicking the can, that you just they were kicking and kicking and kicking as far as they could until they reached that wall.
And they're still kicking the can.
And they're
That's
still
the
kicking.
Worst part about it.
Right.
Today, what is frustrating and disheartening, and you asked me about living in Lebanon when we started.
Yeah.
The sense of palpable anger we feel of a political elite and the government who are still functioning as if it's a business as usual.
Yeah.
The country is crash landing. People are eating from garbage cans. I mean, how can you live normally when you see the misery around you? I saw someone today eating from a garbage can. I felt paralyzed. I mean, what do you do in a situation like this? These are not things we're used to seeing in this country.
Yeah.
This is a country where social solidarity between families is amazing. You know this, Ronnie. Where between communities is amazing. And actually, frankly, the only thing that is kept is maybe the silver lining in all of this, or the positive ray of sunshine, if I may call it that, has been Lebanese civil society.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
coming together of civil society to support people in need has been amazing.
Yeah.
The initiatives, they're the ones who are keeping people on their feet. They're the ones who are feeding. It's not the government. It's not the politicians. They're the ones who are feeding people. They're the ones who are sending them, giving money to get people treated. They're the ones who are making sure people have homes. They're the ones who are literally have roofs over their heads, trying to find jobs. Initiatives, the range of initiatives I've seen are just amazing. In both from civil society in Lebanon, individuals, but also expats who are, desperate for ways to help Lebanon and looking for ways to support the country. But this is not sustainable. You need a functioning government that steps in and takes the lead. And they're not doing that. They're still treating, they look at the way civil service appointments took place not too long ago. It's a joke. It's a joke. I mean, it's still, again, a business as usual approach, trying to kick the can down the road. The government is in the middle of negotiations with the IMF, and all of a sudden they're bickering over the size of the debt between government and parliament. How do you go negotiate with the IMF for a desperately needed injection of cash into the country? And the IMF, the issue with the IMF, it's not just the IMF itself. It's not the deal with the IMF as such. Yes, it will unlock some immediate, basically they have the fastest dispersal instrument for dispersing cash around. I never thought I would be somebody who'd be calling for IMF program in Lebanon. Here I am. Okay. But the thing about the IMF is two things, actually. One is reforms are conditional, and without reforms, this country will never stand on its feet.
Right.
And two, it will unlock other support. The European Union, in a conversation 2 weeks ago with the High Representative for the European Union, Borrell, he was very clear. I asked him. He was very clear. No support without the IMF.
He's going to hear this because he's a listener of the podcast, and I know that from sort of his staff and his people so he's going to hear this. But you're pointing at
a lot of interest in this region, by the way.
Okay. All that said, and you eloquently just explained how bleak things are and how incompetent the ruling regime is. You also explained that the social fabric of Lebanon is collapsing in front of your own eyes. We're seeing things that were unimaginable. Your example is very clear, and it hits home that this is not something we're used to. It also ties into the third pillar. And that, to me, for me, that's the foundation of any healthy society. That's Lebanon's middle class. And I'll quote to you one more time. The middle class is swelling the ranks of the poor, with the World Bank estimating that around 50% of Lebanese now live below the poverty line, while thousands are going hungry. Clothes, food, and fuel are becoming unaffordable as year-on-year purchasing power has been halved, with inflation reaching 90% in June. The price of basic goods increased by around 55% in May alone. All this represents an epic collapse with a generational impact. The conversation about the middle class, to me, is not new. And I think that was always in the background. The post-war order, the middle class that left Lebanon, those that could afford to leave, many of them were choosing to return. And there's many Lebanese these are not rich Lebanese that can afford to sort of take huge risks. But many took that risk. They came home. They're leaving again. The middle class that survived the civil war, what was left of it, is either leaving once again or going under and reaching the poverty level. I don't know what the statistics are. I don't know how you can measure these things today, but it seems like the middle class may be the smallest the smallest sort of economic class in the country. And in my mind, it should be the largest and the most robust. Is there anything at this point that can be done to... I mean, it's so unthinkable now that the middle class will return. Does the middle class now depend on other pillars taking hold first so that there can be a healthy middle class later? Or is there something more immediate that can be done? Because I personally, and I don't want to sound too pessimistic here, I can't see a way for the middle class to survive right now. Survive in a way that matters in terms of Lebanon's economy, stability. It seems to be a lost cause at this point. And you tell me if that's too bleak and whether or not there's any immediate measure that can be taken.
Look, to be honest with you, I think that, of course, there's a way to not only help the middle class, but help Lebanon survive. You need to have policies in place. Today, the scale of wealth destruction is massive.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why that wealth is being destroyed in this way is the lack of policy, the lack of decision making. The runaway inflation that we have right now, and we're moving into very uncharted territory, we're moving into possibly hyperinflation, has to do with the fact that there are no capital controls until now, has to do with the fact that there is a massive fiscal monetization, i.e., the state needs to spend. The way the state is spending, because it's bankrupt, it has no money, is they're printing money. They're printing money. So the size, the amount of Lebanese lira in the market has grown to such an extent that it is causing a very rapid increase in prices. The demand, I mean, the expansion in the size of the Lebanese lira is also increasing demand for a non-existent dollar.
Right.
Meanwhile, so this is one aspect, the fact that there is no policy at that level, no policy decision has been taken. Actually, the only policy decision that has been taken this far, and for me it is a policy decision even if it's a de facto one, is to let the middle class and let the depositors and let the businesses take the hit. The only ones paying the price for the crisis today are ordinary depositors whose money is stuck in the banks and who are being forced to withdraw that money today in Lebanese lira, if their money is in dollar, at an official rate, at two different official rates actually. One is the 4,000 Lebanese lira,
exactly,
or 3,900.
Yeah.
Which is, you have a cap. You can only withdraw, depending on how much money you have, you can withdraw up to, I think, $1,000 or $2,000 a month. And then there is anything else above that you want to spend from your money, you pay at the official rate of 1,500 Lebanese lira to the dollar.
Right.
While the dollar is being sold
7,000 today, 8,000?
7,000 to 8,000.
Yeah.
More around 8,000. So people are losing. I mean, there is a de facto haircut that's happened. People don't like the word haircut, but there is a de facto massive.
I personally am not a big fan of haircuts, but yeah,
I can see that. I can see that. No, but there's a massive destruction of wealth that is happening. People are being forced, and in fact, interestingly, the liabilities of the banks have decreased because of this. Because people are withdrawing their dollar amounts in Lebanese lira at less than favorable rates, their own liabilities literally are shrinking.
But does that mean that
leave this for a few more years, and all the losses will have been absorbed by people like me and you and others. And by the way, other people paying the price are the businesses, and I talk about this I sort of hint at it when I speak about the lines of credit.
Yes,
because
right.
people whose lines of credit are what the bank extends to you to allow you to import goods and to get your business rolling. This will stop.
In that sense, is it almost like the policy is permanently scarring the middle class? It's
permanently destroying this country. It's not just about the middle class anymore.
Yeah.
It's about destroying the size of wealth destruction that is happening. You're looking at a middle class, an American university professor, and I talk about their salary.
Yeah,
Whose
you give a
salary
great description of it. Yes.
just to get them a sense, whose
Yeah.
salary all of a sudden now goes from 63,000 a year to 11,000 a year.
Yeah.
So they're making $900 a month just at this because they're being paid in Lebanese lira. I'll use my aunt as an example. My aunt was a public school teacher. She taught Arabic literature for I think she had a career of about 35 or I don't know how many years. Her entire pension is in Lebanese lira. She's all of a sudden seen her income completely disappear because what she was able to live on in a very dignified manner no longer means much.
Yeah.
It's the value of her money is evaporating before her eyes. There's someone who's retired. Talk about people who are about to retire. They've built a career. This was the engineer, the professor, the whatever, who've spent a lifetime saving. They have a pension. They have some savings, and they're not about to start a new career. They can't start a new career.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they go from being able to, have a decent life to not being able to afford healthcare. So what is happening today is criminal. What is being done to this country is criminal. So you ask me about the middle class. It's not just about the middle class. I talk about the middle class. For me, the middle class is the professionals that Lebanon. This country is remarkable for its talent. And it's talent that it's both educated and uneducated. The educational system, I think you saw the episode, was the president of the American University in Beirut. But all the universities here are talking about this. Public school systems. Schools are shutting down. Schools are shutting down. If Lebanon loses its educational system and therefore loses its human capital, what does it have left? It's a human capital. Frankly, for the longest time, we used to say the best export of Lebanon is its people.
Absolutely.
They go outside and they work their magic. So the educational system now is beginning to, if this things continue, it will collapse. And nobody wants to put a cent in state institutions. You talk to donors and they say, we'll try and help as much as we can, but they don't trust state institutions anymore.
That's, I think, a very visible consequence of what's happening. That our peers, a lot of people that we both know, do not want to invest their lives any longer in Lebanon. And the truth is, they don't want to fall from the middle class to the lower class. They don't want to live in poverty. They seek opportunities elsewhere.
Just that, Ronnie. I think some of it is because of that. Some of it is, there are people who fought their life to try and have a decent, and all of a sudden they're seeing, the people are losing hope. And yet at the same time, others are not. And this is, again, in the sense of, I also see in a lot of the people who are part of the October 17th movement, and as you know, there are many different groups.
Sure.
The sense of commitment people have to this country is remarkable.
You're absolutely
right. So
right.
while we're hearing about people who want to immigrate, there are others who are completely committed, and younger people who are completely committed and continue to say, we do not want to immigrate. We want our country back. And we want to build this country. The problem is that, how do you build a country when those that are running it have no interest? They're more interested in their short-term gain than in the survival of Lebanon. And what I find quite astonishing is the link between their own survival and Lebanon's survival somehow is not that clear. I'm not sure how it's not clear. But, maybe if the country collapses, the different political leaders can, make it in their own way. They thrive in chaotic situations. But
it seems to be that they're the most adept at surviving chaos and uncertainty. And I agree with you.
Then you go from being a national leader to going back to being a leader of your own little neighborhood. Bottom line. So it's It's mind-boggling, and it's not a lot. Take the electricity. This is not. These are deeply political issues. These are not about the technicality of it.
Mm.
We know what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Why isn't it being done? It's a political decision. It's a political bottleneck. The leadership today recognizes that the government. I mean, I think finally they've understood the depth of the economic crisis. In the first period, there was a lot of denial.
Yeah.
And they thought that, oh, somebody will come into the rescue. I mean, I was hearing it all the time. Now they recognize the depth of the crisis and that no one's going to come in to rescue.
Maha,
So there is that recognition, but they don't want to share in the losses. They want everyone else to lose, but they don't want to share in the losses.
I'm going to no. On the contrary, but I want to tackle this.
I'll get
No.
I told you I get.
On the contrary,
I get worked up around this. So.
Hey, if I'm the person who makes you scream, then I'll take credit for it, and I'll put like a censored. I'll muffle anything that's said. No, but you're touching on something that I'm curious about, and I didn't want to bring it up in this episode in particular. I kind of wanted to focus only on those 5 pillars, but I think it's important. And before we get into the 4th pillar, I just want to ask you, and you say as much as you'd like about this. I'm bringing it up largely because of the 2005 marker that you eloquently described at the start. And you tell me if I'm wrong in this sort of larger assessment. It seems like the most valiant effort today by the people you're describing who want to stay in Lebanon, don't want to leave, they don't want to give up on the country. They're the same kind of people that we saw get killed. And 15 years ago, somebody you admire, someone that I admire, somebody you knew well, Samir Kassir. And this ties into the 4th pillar. But before we get into that, would you put the onus on the Civil War legacy remaining in the country? And what I mean by that is 1989, which we got into, 1989 is not a marker where violence ends. It's not like, what are they called? The Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Accords of Northern Ireland. In other words, that you see a dismantlement of all sub-state weapons. Or for that matter, the Balkans, where you don't have paramilitary groups that are still sort of tolerated, at least constitutionally or whatever. But they're gone. Another more recent example, you see Colombia looking at a post-FARC scenario, post-weaponized FARC scenario. And I'm saying this in the broadest way, that Lebanon, the post-Civil War era, contains with it much of the Civil War. Now that for 15 years, that included the Syrian army's presence in Lebanon and the Israeli army's presence in the south. More recently, it's clear Hezbollah remains that sort of very, very important player, at least when it comes to the Civil War legacy in the country, meaning that it's a weaponized group beyond state sovereignty. Would you put the burden in any way on that group's ability, and I'll say this carefully, to preserve the worst crop of Lebanese leaders we've ever experienced? Meaning that today you're either directly or indirectly supportive of that group's mission. If you try to rebuild Lebanon the way you would want to, from a civil war to a post-war environment, civil society, state reform, building institutions that work, not the sectarian monster we live with right now. Can you imagine that? So long as there's one group that can say, well, we don't want that, we will either silence it or we will eliminate it if necessary. And instead we'll preserve what we tolerate, meaning that the group that we're familiar with right now, who in a way almost their own survivability in a sense depends on Hezbollah too. So I'm curious about that relationship and if it plays out in terms of taking Lebanon out of its current impasse into something better. And again, as much as you'd like to say on this topic, I know it's a huge topic, and I know Hezbollah is explored in many different ways, but that relationship towards reform and a group's abilities to prevent reform?
Okay, it is a big question. I'll say just a couple of things. Hezbollah is as invested in the system as everyone else. They're invested in it. It is their backyard. And after 2005, they kind of took over the role that Syria used to play in terms of managing different aspects of the country. So they allow you to go do your thing where, it's okay. And the areas that are of strategic interest, don't go anywhere near them.
Right.
So, yes, they do play an important role in propping up the system and maintaining its the way, its modus operandi. However, I would not want to say that they are the only obstacle. They are a major obstacle. And actually, I mean, we saw this in the reaction of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah to the October protests. The first reaction took it personally.
Yes.
They thought this was, oh, you're right to be upset. However, we'll deal with it now. You can go home. The second one was similar. So this sense of taking things personally initially was actually, for me, was a bit, they saw the protest somehow as a challenge to their authority. I think it was more of a challenge to the system that they were invested in protecting. Okay? So, yes, it is a big problem, but it is not the only problem. And I think the other leadership is as invested in maintaining them as they are, because this is where their survival comes from.
Okay.
But if we take this scenario, for example, if Hezbollah decides to pull the plug on Gibran Bassil today,
he's gone.
He's gone. He's gone. I don't know whether he's gone, but then yes, okay, you pull the plug, he's weakened, but then there are other repercussions, because it does have, in terms of the balance of power between the different communities, the reading of this will vary, and its ripple effects will vary for the Christians, for the Sunni.
Sure, of course.
I don't want to get into it because it becomes very complicated.
No, of course. But I guess my no, but I think maybe I said it. I didn't say it the right way. If he were to somehow join in on adventures in state reform, it's a very unlikely scenario. That if he were to really sort of push hard in rebuilding Lebanon, again, unlikely scenario, I don't think we would have the Gibran Bassil that we know. He would be an irrelevant politician at best, and maybe sort of just
why would I agree, but I agree that that's what I'm saying. They are an obstacle because they are invested in a system that protects them. This system is good for them. It's a system that rallies people around sectarian identities, that polarizes individuals, that does not recognize national level movements. It's one where the balance of power is in their favor. It allows them to keep their arms and maintain, their regional agenda, while playing, their local role as part of the Lebanon political scene, etc.
But I guess, but taking it one step further, does the system now survive on the legacies of the civil war? Whether it was the Syrian order until 2005, or whether it's the current situation we have right now?
The system is collapsing as a result of the legacy of the civil war.
Right, okay.
It's not surviving. It's collapsing or at least the power sharing system is still, as I said, it's in trouble because it's completely stuck and it's no longer able to reproduce itself. But the state itself and state institutions are collapsing under the weight of the legacy of the civil war.
I appreciate that perspective. It almost like it shows that despite what they may want or what they may need, they may not actually have that in the long run. So I appreciate that perspective. I won't take too much more of your time. I've already sort of taken up too much of your time. I'll just sort of segue into the fourth pillar, which touches on this. It's in a way, it's something that we thought. I thought that it was a bygone era, but it's still with us. It's the issue of freedom of expression. And I'll quote you to you again. A fourth pillar of the Lebanese system, namely freedoms, is also being eroded. Since independence, Lebanon has been renowned for freedom of speech and a flourishing press. And you go back in time, just like you did with Riyad Salah, by the end of the 1940s, the country was publishing 39 dailies and 137 periodicals in 3 languages. In its heyday, Lebanon acted as a safe haven for dissidents and refugees, boasting a cultural and intellectual life unparalleled in the region, a role it continued to play until recently, albeit much less effectively. Freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, I immediately go back to 2005. And I also remember the valiant efforts of people on the streets, and then these names that emerge and become part of the moment. One in particular, Samir Kassir, and shortly after, Gibran Twaini. And despite their assassinations, protesters, poets, journalists, you name it, people were not shying away. They were still pushing and pushing and pushing. And now in 2020, you have that sort of, those interrogations that we used to know about in the early 2000s, they're happening. They may not be as abusive, they may not be as sort of intimidating per se, but they're happening. And there's that kind of oversight where you wouldn't expect it. And it's in particular things that, I mean, Instagram stories and people just screaming and shouting from their personal profiles, you get called in. Or it could be a tweet where you say the wrong thing and suddenly you're sort of called in. And that form of intimidation seems to be now part of the story once again. Do you think that the Lebanese spirit, if you will, I don't want to sound too cliche here, but that unique ability to lure in, whether it's the regional's best writers and poets, or for that matter, Lebanese still expressing their dreams and desires against all odds, do you think that will survive this moment? Or is there really a risk? Is there a risk here that authoritarianism, especially in terms of freedom of expression, may destroy this sort of extremely important aspect of Lebanese society? So just, I mean, no, you see it as intact. Okay.
No, not intact. I see it as it will survive. This is a country that the sense of innovation, I mean, entrepreneurship, freedom of expression is not just about what you say. It's about the artists, it's about theater, it's about the novelists, it's about the innovators, it's about the engineers. There's a mood, there's a culture, there's a sense of being able to say what you think.
Yeah.
And even though there is an attempt to erode it consistently, as I talk about it in the piece, there was a documentation. I mean, now there's, I think, a group of about 14 different organizations that have come together to defend fundamental rights, even though the judiciary is being shot through and apparently is being quite compliant with this clampdown, or quite pliant in this clampdown against freedom of speech. But I don't see people complying that easily. You see, every time one person gets pulled in, hundreds go down.
Right, that's true, yes.
So the sense that, and the other thing I think that also works, and this is again, being in a society that's made up of so many different communities, means that it's very difficult to build up an authoritarian state in the way you see in other countries.
Yeah.
So there are limits to authoritarianism that you don't have, and this is perhaps the benefits of being living in a multi-sectarian society such as the one in Lebanon. So there are limits to.
But the pluralism will sort of preserve that characteristic, so that the breathing space among communities in a way ensures a certain level of freedom.
there will be some freedom, but the margin is shrinking.
Yeah.
There is a closing in of space for sure, but I think Lebanon will still. It will be impossible to shut it down completely.
Right. Right.
The push against this shutdown. There's too much of a history in this country. This is why I went back to the 1940s.
Yeah.
This is the country where the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance, came out in the 19th century.
Yes.
So it's really also, I'm not one for nostalgia and, it's cultural essentialism, but it is part of the mood of what makes this country what it is. So there is an attempt to closing space. There are attempts to repress, to force people into silence. We didn't talk about refugees, for example. This is a country that's welcomed refugees in the past.
It's true.
And there's an attempt to, all of this. But I think the pushback against it is also quite there and will continue to be there. So it won't be as easy to shut this down. And frankly, if you shut it down, I mean, that's it. That's the end of Lebanon.
I firmly agree with you. Actually, that to me is the end of the country. I completely agree with you on that sentiment. Yes.
You can't do it. You really cannot do it. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, again, this is where this multi-sectarian, plural country, I think helps in this pushback against this closing in of space. But that the space is constricting, definitely it's becoming, less and less. The capacity of people to speak out in certain regions in Lebanon is becoming almost non-existent in some places. So.
Right, but I mean, even when there's that kind of violent reaction, at times leads to death. That the average Lebanese is willing to sort of include that as part of the national trait. And I know, I agree with you. You don't have to be too romantic here, but it's true. It is true that Lebanon plays that role in the region. And if it doesn't play
Samir Kassir was killed on June 2nd, 2005. October 17, 2019, Samir Kassir was very much alive amongst the protesters. He was being quoted by the protesters.
Absolutely.
So it's hard to eradicate a legacy like this.
His fans continue that legacy. They're not intimidated. They stand up. So that's what I meant in terms of that's what makes the country special, is that despite the violent crackdown on freedom of expression, it simply doesn't work. Lebanese have maintained that tradition. So I'm glad you chose the word erosion. I hope it does not result in something more painful. And I agree, it's the end of Lebanon if we lose freedom of expression. I fully agree. Maha, I want to take it to the last pillar. And I like the approach you took in terms of the financial pain we're going through, and that it may actually result in the collapse of state institutions that have not been impacted directly, at least when it comes to politics and the usual sort of economic story we've been discussing. Now, it's got to do with the army and internal security. And the final moment, I quote you to you, the Lebanese system's fifth pillar, the army and the internal security forces, is also feeling the impact of the economic crisis. Like all Lebanese, military and security personnel have seen their incomes and pensions disappear. The salary of the army's commander has declined in dollar terms to around $750 a month, while that of a colonel has gone down to $300, and a soldier $150. The personnel may be faring better than those who have lost their jobs, but they no longer enjoy many of the benefits they previously did. In an environment of heightened tensions, economic pressure on the military and security sector will only grow. More worrisome, this is happening as crime rates have risen in recent months. I am a product of the early 1980s. I don't know what it was like to live in Lebanon in the early 1970s, but I can imagine when these institutions become weaker, and when their soldiers are no longer, let's say, willing to fight, when you have the security of the country that's sort of turning away from crises, I see that as the inevitable breakdown of a country. And to me, April 1975, it happened for many reasons, but this is one of them, that the state institutions no longer operated. So, and you're careful to point that these have not collapsed. That's the one that has not sort of fallen. But would you be that sort of, let's say, bleak in that if these are to sort of pay a price with what we're going through, that we may end up in a familiar situation where 1975 returns, where you have chaos on the streets, an ungovernable situation, and it's perhaps a matter of years before Lebanon is put back together. And I'm trying to see the conclusion of that scenario.
A return to 1975 in the sense of a civil conflict, I don't see that happening now. I don't see that happening because there is no external interest. To have a civil war, somebody has to fund the conflict.
Right. Yeah.
Somebody has to provide money to create militias, fund militias. There's only one group that's armed to the teeth.
Right.
They've got all the battle experience needed,
yeah.
and the rest are not. So I don't see a scenario of a civil conflict in the way the 1975 was. What I'm concerned about today is we are seeing an increase in violence.
Yeah.
We're seeing different trends when it comes to violence. We're looking at rioting. We're looking at sectarian clashes along traditional fault lines. يعني الرماني الشياح بربير etc. And we're looking at a spike in crime, but also a spike in crime. And one statistic that came out recently talked about murder rates increasing, unfortunately, by about 50% for the same period.
Yeah.
We're talking about an increase in car theft, etc.
Yeah.
This is beyond the people going into pharmacies, holding up pharmacies in return for diapers and baby milk. This is much more serious, obviously.
Yeah.
So what I see is that this is a security sector, whether it's the army or even the internal security forces, which I don't talk about in the piece, that is, they themselves are ordinary Lebanese citizens. They're under tremendous strain.
Yeah.
They're being asked to put their own lives on the line in return for a lot of insecurity.
Right.
And if that pillar collapses, then what we're going to look at is more gang-style wars, conflict, turf battles, back to the mood of the 1975 onwards, or the Civil War era, where you had different militias controlling different neighborhoods within the same city, and crossing from one neighborhood to the other becomes a chore.
Yeah.
Or a challenge.
So that's not necessarily fighting, it's more just division, less to do with...
It's fragmentation, turf wars.
Yeah.
This is where you have, warlords will rise with power vacuums. I mean, the developments become very non-linear. It's hard to predict what will emerge where.
Right.
But if there are small power vacuums in areas, for example, in northern Lebanon, or in other parts of the country, you will see new things emerge. People will step in to fill in these vacuums, whether it's the local thug or someone willing to pay a few dollars to create their own little private militia or whatever. I mean,
right.
So we may see more and more of this, unfortunately, and this is the part that is very worrisome. And there are examples in countries that are not sectarian. Take Venezuela, for example. Venezuela, it's gang wars. The rates of crime there are huge, and the country is run by rival gangs because they thrive in situations of chaos. They prey on people's vulnerabilities. People in Lebanon are becoming incredibly vulnerable. Their lives are very precarious. You mentioned the figure that I talk about, which is the World Bank estimating 50% of the Lebanese population falling below the poverty line.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2 million people. for an average population of 4.2. And we're not talking about refugees. This country is a host to around 1 million Syrian refugees who are also facing very circumstances. So this is huge. And no amount of support from civil society is going to be able to sustainably take care and support these people. The international community is now coming in with humanitarian support for the Lebanese. But these are all short-term measures. It's putting Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Yeah.
That's not the way you deal with it. So this is, unfortunately, anyway, if things continue the way they are, I don't see the security institutions collapsing tomorrow. Far from it. I think there's a lot of attempts, particularly when it comes to the army, to keep things together. But there needs to be a lot more leadership. I don't think they're ready for what's coming. They're just not ready for what's coming.
You know, Maha, so I want to say a few things here. First, I think this is the longest episode I've ever recorded. And it reminds me, but that's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's not because of the technical glitches or the sort of the fun stuff that we're all the fun in quotes. It's because you're very patient and you let me ask a lot of challenging questions, and you paint a picture that's simple to understand but very layered and complex at the same time. And it reminds me of conversations I used to have with my father. And for that reason, it's an honor for me to even ask you these questions and get your perspective. Before we started recording, this would have never occurred to me had we not had this conversation, that you are the photographer behind one of my favorite photos of my father. I never knew this. I have the photo. I look at it regularly. I never knew it was your photo. And it's from a happier sort of, it's a happy moment that you captured where he's sort of in his element. And I can see him kind of pontificating with people, and he's wearing that sort of funny top hat.
Cuban hat.
Yeah, he looks like he's happy, and it's a lovely photo, and you caught him at the right moment. I'd just like to wrap it up with maybe, if you can, many people that were eliminated for sharing similar passions, wanting a better country. And you're still committed to Lebanon. I mean, you're not leaving. I assume you're staying put. And many people that we know, even if they are leaving, they're leaving reluctantly. They're not leaving because they want to. They're leaving because in many ways they have to. That said, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? And I guess what I'm asking is, things look so bleak right now. And things look so pessimistic. You still have protesters on the street, but you also have a regime that's very stubborn and unwilling to reform. You have a country that seems to be on the verge of collapse. Your article, in a way, explains it, and these are the foundations that are falling. Is there any sort of hope in your mind? And if you can, if you see fit, maybe even a conversation you had with my father that may echo that sentiment, or just sort of fighting for the country against all odds. Do you see sort of a better future for Lebanon?
I wouldn't be here if I didn't. And I think this is what brought your father back to Lebanon and kept him in Lebanon. In the most dangerous of times. And his loss, frankly, is irreplaceable, not only for the family and his friends, but for the country. I'm not gonna go more into this, but his passion and belief in this country was something that always struck me. And his capacity to read through and link, bring people together and link different dots that were not necessarily visible to others.
Right.
Lebanon today stands at a very critical juncture, and it is I describe it. I mean, I don't say these words, but it is collapsing, and it is an epic collapse. But I look around me and I see the people who are staying, the people who want to stay, and the people who are still fighting for Lebanon. The people who are outside Lebanon and are still fighting for Lebanon.
Yeah.
And I think this is a country worth fighting for.
Yeah.
So, do I see any hope? Yes. Is it an incredibly difficult struggle? Double yes. Are there people still here who believe in this country and want to make a difference? Absolutely. Will they be, is there a chance to save it? Absolutely. Will we all be able to? I don't know. I really don't know. Because to be realistic, there are today things that the Lebanese can do, but there is a lot also that is outside their control.
Right.
When we talk about geopolitical challenges.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what Lebanon is dealing with will only happen through a regional political settlement, not the internal stuff. The internal stuff is in the hands of Lebanese politicians.
Mm.
That's where they're being criminal, because there's a lot they can do.
Yeah.
However, the broader pact that ended the civil conflict in Lebanon, there's a need for another regional pact today that your father was trying to work on when he was killed. There is a need for that kind of a broader regional pact today, because there's no way Lebanon will be able to emerge from this intact without a broader kind of geopolitical and regional guarantee.
Yeah. So both seem to be the stories of our times. I mean, that's these are the two struggles, and they dance with each other over the years. People are fighting both battles, and yeah, I it's a very good way of putting it, that there's a lot of hope and aspiration, and there's also a very harsh reality. You're very kind with explaining to me many things that I'm curious about, going over your piece as well. All this will be linked up to the episode, and for bringing my father back to life in a way through your own eyes. I really appreciate that. I don't know what else to say other than thank you so much.
No, it's been a pleasure, Ronnie. Really, it has been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and it's been fun. It's been a fun evening.
We'll do this again. We'll catch up where we left off. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.